The Crime Intelligence head of the SAPS, Dumisani Khumalo, appearing again before Parliament's ad hoc committee, probing allegations of corruption within the SAPS. Eldred de Klerk is the crime expert who's been watching all of this. Eldred, good afternoon to you. It's been very interesting to see how all of this has played out over the last few days. Quite a long session for Khumalo. He's already, of course, testified at the Madlanga Commission. Are we getting a much clearer picture of what actually has been going on in the SAPS? I mean, from what Khumalo says, it's absolutely riven with corruption.
Good afternoon, Stephen, and good afternoon to the Channel 405 family and viewership. Indeed, as the chair in his concluding remarks, one of the members said to, I think it was one of the members the MPs, said to General Khumalo that they were hoping that he would bring the evidence that others said he would. What he did make, though, and he was consistent over the day and a half, is that, as you concluded, in his assertion that the South African Police Service is riddled with members who do the bidding of cartels, who are involved in criminal activities, and or are assisting criminals in their endeavors. So essentially, he told us that what is happening in SAPS is actually justifying our lack of confidence and trust in the institution, and that is worrisome. He further went on to say, Stephen, that his own efforts to try to bring a different way to crime intelligence, to investigations, especially when it comes to organized crime, has been met with major success. However, it's also been met with resistance and inertia to take and deepen and institutionalize these practices. And that, Stephen, is very worrisome for the diagnosis or the prognosis as to how do we change the South African Police Service going forward.
One of the things he said, and I mean, it was a very interesting series of questions for him to be asked, but he suggested that sometimes people in the SAPS get involved in cases where they don't really need to be, so that they can actually extort the suspects in the case. In the Senzo case, which of course we paid a lot of attention to over the last couple of years, is a really interesting example. I mean, we all know about the rise of extortion gangs in South Africa since the pandemic, but this would suggest then that SAPS officers are using their position to extort things from criminal suspects.
Stephen, we've been hearing anecdotal evidence that the South African Police Service mirrors what happens and is a microcosm of what happens in society, whether this is extorting shopkeepers or whether this is extorting families to provide information, or whether this is extorting suspects or perpetrators. So what he's saying is simply confirming, because we trust him as a senior police officer to have this understanding, what has already been in the public domain that the South African Police Service or some members of the South African Police Service is extorting suspects, is extorting families and extorting businesses, and maybe getting involved in cases, as he says, or running duplicate investigation or parallel investigations to either thwart that case, to undermine it, or to actually, cause the case to fail because they are being paid to do so.
There are other issues around this, and it was quite interesting for me to look at the difference between the way the evidence leader, so a legal professional, asks questions, and his job is to kind of be, I suppose, neutral, to get as many facts as he can get. And we saw during the testimony of Khomoso Pakhlane how frustrated Advocate Arendse can get when he doesn't get straight answers to his questions. But then we have the MPs, and we must never forget that the people on the panel are politicians. And I wonder sometimes if we can kind of see where their interests lie through the questions that they ask someone like Dumisani Khumalo.
Stephen, that's quite an astute observation, because I have been also following the comments in the chat on a number of channels and actually looking at what public sentiment is. And the observation or the comment from certain members of the public is, in fact, they can see the colors or the stripes that certain MPs are are wearing or displaying through the questions that they're asking. They can also see whose side they think the MP is on, or whose interest, whether it's their party interest or a single member's interest, or whether they're supporting one or other side of the narrative. In discussion with your colleague Iman Rupetti a couple of months ago already, we forget that this is going on for a while now, but fairly earlier on, she recognized and raised the fact that there was this grounded narrative, this narrative set down on the 6th of July, that this is the state of play. And since then, as evidence one way or another has fallen on each side of that narrative, we see that there's a grounded bias, a bias for who's guilty, a bias for who's right and who's wrong, and a bias for who's supporting whom, or who's on which side of the argument. And people are looking to the MPs and looking to see where they fall on what side of this particular equation when it comes to who's right and who's wrong, and who's guilty and who's not guilty. And that's peculiar, Stephen, if I may just make a final point on this, is that finally at the end of General Khumalo's testimony, we get what is, I think, the most salient point when it comes to PKTT. And he was been trying to make it for a day and a half. And that is, it's not the survival of the PKTT that he or others might be fighting for. It is the lessons learned and the methodology and the way they've structured themselves that he thinks is well worth instituting and taking on as the South African Police Service, because he believes that that is one of the most effective ways going forward to fight the scourge of organized crime.
On that note, thank you very much indeed, Eldred de Klerk, the security expert. Really do appreciate you helping to unpack this very important week of testimony.